Okay, see somebody still arriving. That's what I want to. Okay, hi everybody. This is the last talk of this year's session of the Research Colloquium. I'm very pleased to introduce our guest today, Professor Mary Grantham O'Brien. Mary is a professor of German in the School of Languages, Linguistics, Literatures and Cultures at the University of Calgary in Alberta. And her research focuses on the perception and production of second language speech with an emphasis on the real world implications of speaking with an accent. So please join me in welcoming Professor Grantham O'Brien to today's session. Thank you very much, and I let you share the screen.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for being here today. I'll share my screen and then we can just get started. So I would like to especially thank Dr. Enrica Picardo for inviting me today. There have been many times when I've asked Dr. Picardo to take on a particular task. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you today and to perhaps return the favor, because it seems like I'm asking you for favors all the time, Enrica. So anyway, so today, as you know, on the basis of what you read, I'm only going to be talking about some of the research that I shared with you, and then hopefully our discussion can then focus on other aspects of the research or additional questions that you might have about what I present today. So we're talking about accent bias in the Canadian context, which is, you know, kind of a special context. I think the more we do research in a Canadian context, we realize, you know, that so much of the research that's carried out in other places might not necessarily be totally relevant in the Canadian context. And there's just a study that one of our students carried out where we showed, you know, a lot of what we thought we knew about accent bias and kind of how people responded to accent might be a little bit different in Canada from how it is in other places in the world, and in a good sort of way. So anyway, but you can ask me about that later. So on to the research. So the research that I'm going to be talking about today, and the research that you read about, was carried out with my colleague Pavel Trofimovich at Concordia, Kim Taylor-Reid, a graduate student at Concordia, and Alison Bite, who was a graduate student of mine, a master's student of mine here at the University of Calgary. And this was supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So just a moment, I'm going to end the show for just a moment, and I want to share this with you. You don't have to go there yet, but I want you to have that before we get started with the presentation. Okay, so what I'm going to be telling you about today is research, as I said, that I carried out at Concordia. And, you know, Concordia, of course, is in Montreal, which is you know, although it's in a French-speaking province in Canada, it really is a multilingual society. And especially if we think about the level of individual bilingualism, you know, so many speakers speak both French and English. And there were so many instances where, you know, I would interact with who I thought was a native speaker of French, and I would ask them a question and immediately they would flip on their English. And, you know, although sometimes there would be some, you know, with some errors in their grammar, or, you know, sometimes their pronunciation would be accented, I could really understand what they had to say. And I was so impressed as a non-speaker of French myself with what it was that they did with both of their languages. So anyway, that's just kind of the context for the research that I carried out here. So what you're going to be listening to and what we're talking about in this study is what we call the suitcase narrative. So you can see it here. It's just a series of pictures that participants were asked to describe. You know, this has been used over and over again, actually, in pronunciation research. And the nice thing about it is that it can be, you know, that the vocabulary that participants are required to use is really kind of basic. You know, we can use more specific or more, you know, kind of complex grammar and vocabulary, but in general, it works pretty well regardless of the level of students. So, and what participants did in my study and what I'll be talking about in both studies today are just two of the scales that we're talking about. First, accentedness, and that's rated generally, especially
Yeah, Mary, do you want to share the screen? There is a student.
Oh, you don't see it yet?
And no,
Oh,
because you unshared. Thank you.
oh, shoot. Oh, no.
Thank you, Kanza, too. Because you said I unshare for a moment.
Oh, and then I didn't reshare. Okay, sorry
okay,
about that.
no problem.
Sorry about that. Okay, so
you can just show maybe the slide. Yeah, that's the slide
okay.
we missed.
So this is the one that I was talking about, right? So you can see these people run into each other and, you know, so the vocabulary is, it can be very basic or it can be more complex depending on students' levels. Okay, so these two continua that we're going to be talking about today. First, accentedness, which in a lot of the previous studies was rated on a scale of 1 to 9. In the studies I'll be talking about today, it was a 1,000-point scale, but, you know, at the end of the day, there's been some research on it and it doesn't really matter how big the scale is. Participants tend to be able to use the scale well, and they tend to show agreement. So accentedness, from heavily accented to no accented at all, and comprehensibility, which has to do with understanding. So that tends to be rated on potentially a 9-point scale, perhaps 100 or 1,000-point scale. But at the end of the day, we move from hard to understand to easy to understand. Okay, so now if you want to go to that link that I shared with you, once you're there, you can let us know, and then I'll ask Dr. Picardo to get started with
the sample. Huh?
Okay. Yeah, exactly. So I'll play a speech sample, and then you can start with question 1. Okay.
Okay. You tell me when I have to.
All right. Is anybody not there yet? If you could let us know if you're not there.
Were you able to go to the link and go to the page?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Because we don't see you all. Yeah, but I don't see any hands. So everybody. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay. There. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Okay, so what's going to happen is you'll rate the speech samples again on these two 9-point scales, heavily accented to no accent at all, and hard to understand and easy to understand. So what you'll do is you'll listen to a speech sample. Dr. Picardo will release the survey. You'll answer a question about accentedness. Then we'll move on to one about comprehensibility. Then we'll move on to the second speech sample, rate for accentedness and comprehensibility, and then the third speech sample. Okay, and these were actual speech samples from the study itself. So here we go, the first one.
So we were in the city, and at the corner of a street, a man and a woman just like hit each other, and they both have a suitcase. So when they hit each other.
Okay, so now the question about accentedness, if you'd like to rate it, so you can start it, Enrica.
Yeah, just sorry, somebody says we have no access to the poll. Why wouldn't you know?
Coming. So once you started, Enrica.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I do start, huh? Like this. Okay.
Okay, so we're going to rate for accentedness. Do you see scores coming in, Enrica?
Not yet. Oh, yes, both 17. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So now, Enrica, if you could just move forward onto the next one, there will be a question for you about speech sample 1 and comprehensibility.
Done. Question 2. How comprehensible is the first speech sample?
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the second speech sample, which you can rate after you've heard it. Okay, so second speech sample.
The first picture shows the street of a city with high building and probably busy street. In the second image, we see a man and a woman who are both.
Okay, Enrica, if you want to move on to
next.
Yeah. Okay, if you'd like to rate that one, that would be great.
Okay.
Okay, if you want to
Yep.
move then on to the question about
Next.
comprehensibility. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
We're
let's move
missing
on.
two
Okay.
more
Those last
people. Yeah. One. Okay. Now
Okay,
we're
perfect.
there.
Now let's move on to the third speech sample. Once again, you'll just rate them both.
There were once in a large city where there was many skyscraper and a few small building between two skyscraper. And I don't see any red light, but on the sidewalk there was many people walking by. And on the corner of the street, I see a man with I don't know the color in English, but I'd say a blue suit.
Okay.
Okay. Next.
Accented.
Accentedness.
Mhm.
Right. Next. Hmm?
Perfect. And then once you have all of those, if you just want to stop the,
The poll. Yeah.
well, yeah.
Okay. I
Okay,
think we have them all. So stop.
perfect. Thank you so much for your assistance.
You're
with that.
welcome.
It's not a one-person job. Okay, so now let's see what the results are. I'm going to share my screen with you. And just a moment, I need to re-share my screen so that I'm sharing the right thing. Here we go. All right. So let's look at those results. So for the first speech sample, it seems as though you found it to be relatively not so accented. And then if we move on, and you understood it quite well. Okay, that was speech sample 1. Now, number 2, we can see that oops, I don't know what happened. Anyway, wait, let's go back. We missed the accentedness. Okay, here we go.
Oh,
Okay.
first the speech, comprehensible. Yeah.
Okay, now let's move on to, okay, the second speech sample.
Yeah.
Okay, you found it to be maybe more along the middle, right? We see kind of more variability in your ratings and certainly less at the higher end, right? So you found this one to certainly be more accented than the other. Nonetheless, your ratings once again are kind of more varied than for the first one, but in general, you tended to understand it, although there might have been some difficulty among some of you, but then, we see, interestingly, we have some at 1 and some at 9, but mostly clustered around the middle for the second speech sample. Moving on to the third speech sample, it's kind of a lot like the second one, right? We see that it's accented once again, and then in terms of understanding, you tended to understand it quite well. Right? So this is how, not exactly with a poll like this, but this is how we tend to carry out this research, right? Participants listen to a speech sample and they rate it for accentedness and comprehensibility, and then they move on to the next speech sample, right? So I'll get back to my study then, just so you can see what it's all about. Okay, so there we go. So this brings us to the question of who actually speaks with an accent. And I think it's really important to distinguish what it is that we mean by accented speech. So I'm going to play 2 speech samples for you, and then I'd like you to speak up and let me know whether or not these individuals speak with an accent. I won't have you rate them, but I'd just like you to listen to them.
Please call Stella. Ask her to bring these things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob.
Okay. That was number 1. Number 2.
Please call Stella. Ask her to bring these things with her from the store. 6 spoons of fresh snow peas, 5 thick slabs of blue cheese, and maybe a snack for her brother Bob.
Okay, so if you could speak up, that would be great because I can't see the chat. So did these individuals speak with an accent, and how were those different from those first speech samples that you rated? You can feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Oh, Mariah?
Yeah, hi. So what I understand accents to be all throughout my life is that, for example, this person has a British accent, this person has an Indian accent, this person has like an Australian accent, whatever, an Arabic accent. So the idea that accent is how clear you speak English or how close it is to the native language is like a misconstrued understanding of accent, in my opinion. I think accent is just like the intonation and the different pronunciation of words that you use, but nobody really has a clearer accent than the other or a better accent. It's just like the way that you speak a language, if that sort of makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was a great description of your understanding of accent. And, it's fully in line with a lot of the research that's out there. I think maybe somebody else had a hand up too.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't.
Sorry, that was me. I was not sure if I wanted to say it after what Maria said. But I thought that for the 2 speech samples that we use here, they are recognized dialects of English in a way that people don't really recognize some dialects of English spoken by, particular communities of immigrants. But there's an element of possession here, which isn't present in there's an element of possession for these 2 dialects, which, and I know it's wrong, but it is I know it's wrong in terms of that shouldn't happen, but I'm saying that is what I think distinguishes these from those, right?
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely a difference. So thank you. I don't know if there's anybody else.
Yeah,
Patty?
Paddy. Yeah.
I agree with Kanza, but I'm Irish and Scottish and have had to translate English to English for my family before, like when they've been in Canada and they're speaking English to other native English speakers or L1 English speakers, and translation is required. So just a comment on that.
Absolutely. I mean, so there even can be a level of understanding or lack thereof among native speakers. It's true. And I think that there was one other person.
Melissa, yeah, please.
And I'll jump in to say that I'm from Texas, and same thing. Like if I go up to Northern Ontario, the Sudbury, people have a hard time understanding me if I'm not trying to mimic a Canadian accent. So,
Right.
And vice versa, it's very hard for me sometimes to understand what people are saying within, the same continent. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, this was a good discussion. Oh, maybe one more. Oh, that was Melissa.
No, that's
okay.
it, Melissa. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you everyone for these great contributions. So I would argue as a researcher that all of these examples are examples of accent because accent really has to do with a listener, right? So we can talk from a listener's perspective, and that has to do with a listener's perception of the extent to which pronunciation deviates from some sort of expected norm. So Melissa, like you, kind of going between these 2 settings where I grew up in Ohio and I started my master's program in Texas. And I remember a student saying to me, wow, you talk funny. And I won't even try to say it the way he said it to me, right? So he was expecting me to sound like a Texan. I did not. And so, he thought that I spoke with an accent, and I do indeed, right? So at the end of the day, it's really important to remember that native speakers speak with an accent, and it really has to do with the listener. Okay, so that's an important kind of baseline for us too. But what I'm interested in studying then in my own research is that of a foreign accent. And that's pronunciation that deviates from an expected norm, but is influenced by an individual's other languages. So whether or not, when I speak German, for example, although my German is pretty good, and I started learning it relatively early on in life, I might be rated quite well on that scale, but I'm not a native speaker. Whereas when I speak French, which I speak horribly, it tends to be influenced not so much by my English, but by my German, right? So there are interesting interactions among languages, the more languages a person learns, right? And so it's really important to remember that when we're talking about foreign accent, it's that effect from one language onto another, as opposed to, a regional variety or dialectal pronunciation, which is what we're talking about when we talk about accents more generally. And early research on pronunciation, and I would say until probably about 2005, this is kind of where we see the switch in research on pronunciation, we were really focused a lot on accent, right? What can we do about accent? Is that, this non-native speaker foreign accented, and what can we do to make them sound more like a native speaker? The good news for those of us working in second language pronunciation and second language pedagogy is that we as a field have tended to shift over time. And our focus is no longer on getting rid of people's accents, right? Because that's nearly impossible. We're really focused on comprehensibility. And that has to do with a listener, once again, a listener's perceptions of the ease or difficulty in understanding speech, right? And once again, like accentedness, this is rated along a scale depending, today we did a 9-point scale. The research that I presented to you in the papers and that I'm going to talk about, that's a 1,000-point scale. But regardless of what it is that we're talking about, it's this scale. There's another term that I'm not going to talk about today, but you can ask me questions about it later, and that's intelligibility. That also has to do with understanding, but intelligibility, the way that we test for intelligibility is different. So if we're going, and intelligibility has to do with real understanding of words. So for example, if I am, if I want to see what it was that you understood, maybe I would have you transcribe everything that you hear. And I would see how many words you actually didn't hear. And that would tell me, about your understanding, right? So you can ask me about the difference between comprehensibility and intelligibility later on, but today for this part, I'm only talking about comprehensibility. So let's move on. If you have any questions though during the presentation, don't hesitate to speak up. I can't see you, but you can just go ahead and speak up. Okay, so what do accents tell us? Well, they tell us a few things. They tell us, for example, where a person is from, potentially how old a person is. If you listen to that third speaker, you might have noticed that his accent was a little bit different from those of the first and second speaker. It was perhaps a little bit heavier, but it certainly was different, right? He was a bit older. He was less accustomed to speaking English potentially, right? So sometimes an accent tells us that. Often it tells, especially when we're talking about accents in one's first language, there are certain places where an accent tells us a lot about a person's social class. So those are things that they do tell us, but there are a lot of things that accents don't tell us. For example, how likable a person is, right? Whether this person would make a good friend, okay? Accents don't tell us anything like that. Or how beautiful someone is, or how smart someone is, right? There are so many things that accents don't tell us. But interestingly, there's been a lot of research and listeners are happy to, listen to a speech sample and say how likable a person is on the basis of their accent, right? It's kind of horrible that people would be willing to do that. But, so it's really important to remember accents do tell us some things, but they don't tell us a lot of things. So let's look at those ratings. We did look at them just very quickly after you did the rating and you did the survey, but let's compare those accent and comprehensibility ratings. So which ones were higher? Accentedness or comprehensibility? If you just want to speak up, because I can't see the chat.
One of the things that I noticed about the third sample was that I think maybe we share a common language because I understood everything he said, but I found it sometimes hard to understand him because of grammar. So
Wow.
I absolutely understood everything you were saying. I think I understood every word apart from in the beginning, but there was a bit, but it was just the grammar at one point. Yeah. So that was interesting for me.
Right. Yeah. So there's, we might differentiate kind of in other studies between comprehensibility, you know, like, did you understand every word versus comprehension? Like, could you understand the story, you know, big picture, right? So that's really an important aspect too. And in a lot of our current research, we're using scripted speech just to kind of manipulate some other variables. That's a really great point. Thanks. I think there was somebody else who raised their hand.
That was me. So I am an ASL teacher. Like, I've worked in ASL for a long time. So my ear is kind of attuned to many accents, and I find it comprehensible, because if I have students from a certain language group, a lot of students from a language group, I kind of get used to the way that particular way, and my comprehensibility is high. Right. I think, in comparison to someone who might have been not used so much to ESL students from this particular group.
Absolutely. So experience plays a really important role in comprehensibility ratings. We found that kind of across the board. That's a great point, Natalia. Okay. Tina, I think you might be next.
Yeah, I think for myself, it varied between the different speakers. And I think one of the differences that I noticed was enunciation and even just pace. Those are two things that I found were factors in comprehensibility for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So the pace issue is something that falls generally under the term fluency. So a lot of pronunciation studies might look at comprehensibility, intelligibility, and fluency. In our studies that you read for today, we called it flow, right? But it's really about kind of the speed with which a person speaks, the likelihood that a person is going to repeat what they said, or, you know, kind of pause in the middle. So absolutely, these do play really important roles in all of this. Okay, so if we're ready to move on, we know generally from the research that comprehensibility ratings tend to be overall more favorable than accentedness ratings. And in other words, foreign accents, even though somebody might be rated as having a high foreign, you know, maybe, you know, they've got a thick foreign accent, as we say, you know, a heavy foreign accent. In general, we found that accents can be understood quite well. Right? You know, in spite of the fact that people who perhaps don't have a lot of experience with them might say, oh my gosh, I can't understand that individual. They speak with such a heavy accent. In fact, when we probe a little further, in general, we find that many foreign accents can be understood quite well. Okay, so before we get started talking about the research, then, we know generally that foreign accents are highly salient. There was some early research by Flagey in 1984 showing that speech samples that were accented, you know, produced by non-native speakers that were less than a second long, people could pick out which ones were produced by native speakers and which ones were non-native speakers, right? There are certain aspects of certain segments, you know, certain vowels and consonants where people can pick up on them very easily, you know, even when they're not embedded in words. Right. We also know that foreign accents generally are rated consistently. So when listeners hear them, they can say, oh, yes, that is a heavy foreign accent or not. And we know, as I said before, that they're often not associated with reduced comprehensibility. Okay. And then what we also know then is that most non-native speakers are going to speak with a foreign accent. The likelihood that somebody is going to pass as a non-native speaker, if they've started learning a second language after the age of about 3, is very low. So we can say, you know, across the board, basically, you know, if you've started learning a language after 3, you're probably going to speak it with a foreign accent. But that doesn't mean that, you know, we're lost or that we should give up, right? There are certain things that we can do. And I'll be happy to talk about, you know, how we can train pronunciation in the classroom during the second part of class today. We also know that people tend to make judgments about people who speak with a foreign accent. And, you know, it's often quite unfair. And we know that raters are consistent in their ratings of foreign accent. Okay, so moving on then to these studies that I had you read for today. The underlying assumption when we carry out second language speech ratings is that listener ratings are stable and that they serve as the gold standard, right? So if we're going to look at pronunciation generally within the field of pronunciation specialists, we rely on listeners, right? That said, many people who are interested in pronunciation work in phonetics. And actually, I'm a phonetician by training as well. And so it's possible for me to make measurements of pronunciation and to determine the extent to which one person's speech differs from another person's speech, right? But within the second language pronunciation research, where we're looking at not only differences, but we're looking at ways to kind of distinguish among speakers and to improve speech overall, we tend to rely on listeners. Okay, but we know also that there are a lot of biases out there. And so what we see generally is that people tend to perceive foreign accented speech as less truthful. We also know that speaking with an accent can have real world impacts, and it can affect things like ratings of intelligence, competence, and diligence, wages that a person receives. So often people who speak with an accent, and in particular certain accents, like Spanish, for example, in the American South, they tend to earn lower wages. It can affect housing decisions, a willingness of a landlord to rent something to someone because a person speaks with a foreign accent, and hiring decisions, right? So these are real world implications and they're pretty heavy, right? And as we said before, it has nothing to do with competence or anything else, right? So it's really important as we're going through this research today to think about the fact, that we're not just talking about interesting ratings and, what it is that we find out from the kind of research that we do. It's really important to think that these are weighty matters, okay, and even court decisions. Tina.
I had a question about the studies that are presented here. Are these studies done within a North American context? So foreign accents as perceived in North America?
Yes. Actually, I think they all are. Lindemann might be in a German context, if I remember correctly. But she might also be in a North American context. So yes, I mean, much of the pronunciation research, it's changing over time, but much of what we know about pronunciation is carried out actually mostly, well, in the US and Canada, I would say.
Okay, because I wondered if this would still hold true if it was a foreign accent in a non-North American context, and whether those biases would still exist. And I don't know if you know any about research.
Yeah, I mean, in general, a lot of it still does hold, but it really depends kind of on the level of multilingualism within a community, right? The extent to which people are used to hearing accents and the extent to which people interact with non-native speakers and so forth, right? So, if the world becomes more globalized, I think what we think we understand about pronunciation is going to change because people are going to be interacting a lot more regularly with non-native speakers, and they're just going to have to deal with the fact that actually they do understand non-native speakers. And so yeah, I would say that there are so many things that play a role in the ratings that especially as we move ahead, things are going to start changing.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so let's move on. If we're talking about social bias, which is an important factor that we controlled for, we're really talking about some sort of imposed bias, right? Somebody says something about somebody else, and we want to see the impact of this social bias on other people. So in our case then, the social bias that was imposed was this manipulation, right? It was either a positive or a negative bias. And what we were interested in was whether or not verbalized biases, whether listeners would go along with them. And according to previous research, it seems that when a researcher, let's say, but also in the real world, when somebody verbalizes their bias, if somebody holds a similar bias, this can be reconfirmed and strengthened in terms of existing stereotypes, right? So if we go back to the very beginning of my presentation, I don't know if you remembered, but I tried to prime you for the ratings that you were going to give. I don't know if you noticed, but I was speaking very positively about my experience in Quebec with non-native speakers of English. And so I provided you, before you even started the rating task, with a positive prime. I was trying to get you in a good mood about these non-native speakers of English whose speech you were going to be rating. Maybe you noticed it because you read the two articles, maybe you didn't, right? And so this was an example of social bias. Interestingly, if speech is marked as being produced by a non-native speaker, research on reverse linguistic stereotyping, Rubin is really the main researcher here, has shown that listeners might impose errors on speech. So I'll give you an example. In Rubin's studies, they take, let's say, one recording that's been recorded by a native speaker of English. Okay, and they'll have listeners rate it in two different conditions. In one condition, they'll have it presented with a picture of a Caucasian individual, right? And listeners rate it, they can understand it, there are no errors, et cetera, et cetera. They'll take that same speech sample and pair it, let's say, with someone who looks like they might be from China. And interestingly, that same speech sample will be rated more harshly, and listeners will report actually hearing errors in the speech sample because of the picture that's been associated with it, right? So, I mean, these biases are real. And if we label speech as being produced by a non-native speaker, listeners also report finding it more difficult to understand. Okay. Now on to the studies. This study you read, and so, but I'm happy to answer more questions about it, but I just wanted to speak about it with you today. So here we go. So the goal of this study was to determine whether ratings of second language English provided by these English-speaking Montrealers could be primed via a biasing manipulation. Okay, and what we proposed was that ratings would be more favorable in the positive prime condition as compared to the negative prime condition. So as you know, these speech samples were produced, they were L2 English picture descriptions produced by these 40 speakers of Quebec French. It was that image that I showed you. Listeners were all Anglophones born and raised in Quebec. We had a group of baseline listeners from a range of ages, and then 40 participants who received that biasing manipulation. 20 received a positive prime and 20 received a negative prime. Okay, and this is what the rating interface looked like. Participants would click on listen, and then they would have to rate the speech sample first for accentedness and then for comprehensibility. And as I said, it was a 1,000-point scale. All right. So in terms of social biasing, this was this is what participants heard in the positive prime condition. You can take a look. You can see that like what I said at the beginning of today's presentation, being impressed about good service in English. Clearly, you could tell that this person was a native speaker of French, but their English was really good. They had an accent, but the grammar it sounded good and the grammar wasn't bad. And then in the negative priming condition, it's just kind of this sense that, oh my gosh, I can't believe that they don't provide adequate service in English. A French speaker didn't bother to learn English well, could barely understand this individual, and the accent was awful, and the grammar didn't make sense. Right, so this is really what we're talking about here. I can assure you, so Kim Taylor-Reid, who was the first author on this paper, she's the one who delivered these biasing manipulations, and she just delivered it much better than I delivered the one that I provided today, right? It was just kind of, as she was getting things set up, she was just, telling a little anecdote to participants there. So this is what happened. Participants came into the lab, they were greeted, they had some directions, they practiced rating some speech samples, then they received the positive or negative orientation, they did the rating, and then they did some questionnaires and debriefing. So here are some results, just very quickly, you know these results. Basically what happened in the positive orientation condition, both younger and older listeners upgraded speakers compared to the baseline. And in the negative orientation, we see that older listeners downgraded speakers compared to the baseline. So this is what we expected with the negative orientation. Interestingly, however, this was what was not expected. Younger listeners tended to upgrade speakers compared to the baseline in this negative orientation condition. And here's just a nice image that shows it. The baseline here in the middle is in green. We can see across the board, regardless of listener age, which is along the x-axis, participants rated comprehensibility similarly. However, and then in the positive prime condition, we can see that they upgraded the speech samples, but in the negative prime condition, this is comprehensibility, the same is true for accentedness, we can see that those younger listeners over on the left tended to upgrade even compared to the positive prime condition, but older listeners tended to really kind of grab on to that negative prime, and it did negatively affect the ratings that they provided for comprehensibility and accentedness. So we can frame these results then within mood induction research. When people are in a positive mood, they may pay less attention to errors, and in a negative mood, they might focus on details and errors. But these age effects we found really interesting. We see these generational differences in response to the manipulations, and it has probably a lot to do with being in Quebec. So we talk in the paper, and as you know, there was the French language charter. So older participants kind of had French imposed on them while they were living in Quebec, whereas younger participants, grew up in this diverse, linguistically diverse and ethnically diverse environment. And, they didn't have those negative reactions to foreign accented speech. And in fact, they pushed against them, saying, like, I have a difficult time in French myself. So how dare I, provide negative ratings to these this So we see overall, the baseline ratings are stable. So our research, goes along with previous studies, but we see this social environment as being so important, right? So, we see this manipulation that happened in a lab environment, but we also see the socio-political environment and the reality of being an English speaker in Quebec. Okay, now we're going to talk about a study 2 with the teacher, Natalia, I think that's your name. So, interestingly, as a teacher, and I think that probably many of you have taught or, are planning to teach in the future, teachers are a really interesting group to work with because, they're considered experts and all of these other sorts of things. So we'll continue on with that one. So we know then that teachers are indeed considered expert raters, but we know from previous research that teachers have provided less positive evaluations of written work, for example, when it's paired with foreign accented speech samples. So they might not be immune to bias, right? And we've also seen a more negative assessment of speech samples with a foreign name along with code switching than a native name and code switching, right? So, it's not to say, I'm a teacher as well. I can be affected by these social biases and manipulations. Okay, so if we move on, then the goal of this study was to determine the extent to which these expert raters, these teachers, are affected by a social bias manipulation, and we expected that they would be. So once again, we had the same picture narrative, but it was produced by second language learners of German. I'm going to play a speech sample for you. Even if you don't know German, I think that you'll be able to tell that this was produced by a non-native speaker.
Eines Tages in eine Stadt gehen ein Mann und eine Frau mit ihren Koffer an die Straße. Sie haben einen Unfall, aber sie nehmen die Koffer und gehen nach ihrem Zimmer.
Okay, so there we go. That was, they listened to 24 of these speech samples. So I analyzed these speech samples in a previous study, but they existed. And so I analyzed them for different factors. And so we used them for this study. So listeners, interestingly, were teachers of German. There were 28 of them total. 14 were native speakers, 14 were non-native speakers. And among these groups, we had 14 who were negatively oriented and 14 baseline listeners. We would have loved to do a positive orientation, but frankly, German teachers are not so easy to come by. And so we only did the negative orientation and baseline listeners for this study. Okay, and here you can see what this negative biasing looked like. It was provided by the research assistant, Alison Beit, on this study. So we can see she has taught German. She honestly couldn't believe how little our undergraduate students could do. They're getting majors and, they could barely be understood, accents being awful, et cetera, right? So that was what she said. And it was the same setup as with the previous study, except for number 4, participants were either in the baseline condition or the negative orientation condition. We didn't have a positive orientation. So moving on then, in the baseline condition, generally, we found an interesting result in that native speaking teachers assigned higher ratings than non-native speakers who consistently assigned lower ratings. And in fact, this isn't so out of line with other research. We've tended to find kind of across the board that people who share a common first language tend to rate, in the absence of any sort of social bias, they tend to downgrade speech produced by fellow native speakers. Oh my gosh, I'm so embarrassed by that individual who just can't even pronounce things well, right? So this is kind of a general finding. But where it gets really interesting is in this negative bias condition. And that is that the native speaking teachers assigned lower ratings, right? They flipped the results here, and that they went along with that negative bias that was imposed by the research assistant. Whereas non-native speakers, like those younger Quebecers, they really pushed back and assigned higher ratings. Okay, so this is interesting in terms of teacher status. Second language learners of German downgraded the speech of fellow second language learners in kind of that baseline condition. But when they were exposed to this negative bias manipulation, they showed this enhanced empathy or perspective taking. Like, I get it, like, how dare you say such horrible things about, the students who I might have taught, and I'm like them. And we actually saw those sorts of comments in, while participants were completing the task. So it might be that teacher solidarity plays a role. So the research assistant was in a position of power. So, perhaps the native speakers were kind of going along with the native speaking or the non-native speaking teacher, but she was a teacher, right? And so they say, yeah, we get it. We're fellow teachers too, and we can't believe it. But then for the non-native speaking teachers, right, the native speakers of English, they tended to say, wait a minute, I'm going to empathize with those fellow learners of German and say, no way, that's not okay for you to speak about them in that way. So we see generally that there's this uneven baseline for native and non-native speaking teachers. So we see overall, if we bring these two studies together, that social bias really is a powerful force in the assignment of speech ratings. And we asked participants, we did a debriefing in both studies, and participants didn't mention anything about the biasing manipulation, right? So they were not aware of this manipulation. Nonetheless, as they were going through the study, they really did acknowledge kind of this us versus them mentality during the experiment, right? So they really, although they weren't aware of it, they were certainly affected by that. We see that in the ratings and also in the comments they provided. So overall, what does this mean for our research? Well, listeners' judgments of speech might be less stable than we thought, and previous experiences might play a role in listeners' judgments of non-native speakers, right? It could be examiners, for example, or interviewers, right? There really are potentially, okay, not in the current study, but in the real world, there could be some really heavy implications of this kind of work. So here are some important takeaways, then I'll be done. Okay. What do we remember about accents? They are normal, and they are not a sign of illness or intelligence or competence or anything else, right? Accents are totally normal. And both the speaker and the listener share the responsibility for successful communication. Right? It used to be in the past when we were focusing just on accents that it really had to do with the speaker, and we were going to try to, get rid of accents so that they could be completely understood by native listeners. We no longer feel that way within the research community, and within a globalized world, we have to say, you know what? Non-native speakers are everywhere, and we need to figure out how we're going to work together to communicate effectively. And so, within classrooms, of course, comprehensibility training is not only effective, right, in terms of what it is that we can change, it also, it's totally possible, and it really makes a lot more sense than accent reduction training, because really, who cares if somebody speaks with an accent, as long as they can be understood. All right, so what does this mean within a Canadian context? Our interactions with non-native speakers are prevalent now. They're only going to become more common as more people come to Canada. But this is an important thing to remember. People are unaware of their biases, their linguistic biases. And so when we have people assessing speech, we need them to realize that they are coming to the table with biases. And we need to develop some effective awareness training for assessors of all types. I can say Pavel, who I did this research with, we just got another SSHRC grant about a year ago, where we're working on some bias awareness training for assessors, because it really matters. Okay, and this is especially important in high stakes assessment training, right? It's not like, language is not important for assessments, right? We know that there are all kinds of assessments that take language into account. And it's not just, assessments of, ESL for acceptance into university, which is high stakes enough. But, in the real world, I talked about those examples where, court cases are determined on the basis of a person speaking with an accent or not, right? There are heavy implications of speaking with an accent, right? And so we would like to propose, and we did some research along these lines, and I'll be happy to chat about it, that enhancing empathy might be a way to counteract some of the effects of social bias. So there are some studies out there that show that getting a person's sense of solidarity and empathy up for non-native speakers, that might be a way to counteract the effects of social bias. All right, that's it. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mary. It was really, really interesting and so relevant. Yeah. You know what? When you were thinking, I don't know the others, but me, in spite of reading the articles, I didn't realize you were priming us. I didn't. I totally kind of, it's incredible. Huh? Yeah. And yet you had explained in both articles very well. So I guess, I don't know if it's me, I'm absent-minded, or if some of you had the same thing and didn't really realize you were doing the same thing. It would be interesting to know.
I thought about doing a negative prime for you, but then I thought, since you're recording that, if that's all a person listens to, I didn't want them to just hear the negative prime and to think that I felt negatively about non-native.
Oh yeah, I see. Yeah. Kanza, did you have the same experience with me, like me, or not? I saw your hand and then it disappeared. No,
I thought it was a bad time to say what I was about to say.
Okay, Natalia, yeah.
I think with those people who study languages, right, or who work with languages, we kind of have a heightened awareness, and empathy. We've developed empathy because, especially if you study a foreign language, you understand all the challenges. And then when you are exposed to students who are going through similar challenges, you kind of have that feeling of empathy. So I think encouraging people to study language